Questions 49 to 53 pertain to a passage from a science fiction novel, and question 49 asks us to analyze the first two sentences. Essentially, what we are analyzing here is their tone. The first two sentences relate in a rather matter-of-fact tone that two scientists were examining some newts and that they believed that it would be possible to extract some useful elements from these newts on an industrial scale. Is it D, self-consciously defensive? If it is, then the defensiveness would be very well hidden because it is not at all clear what the narrator would be defending himself and his assistant against. They seem to be simply relating facts at this point. Nor is it overtly satirical, because there is nothing outlandish in it and nothing that suggests mockery. The two options that we are up against are B and C. Is it deceptively bland or vaguely disconcerting? At this point, we come back to the first two sentences and reread them again and see if there is anything that we can find that is vaguely disconcerting. Now, because at this point we may have skimmed over the rest of the text, we may indeed find the text more than vaguely disconcerting. But remember, we are only dealing with the first two sentences. And in these sentences, there is nothing yet to suggest the violence, the inhumanity that will follow in the rest of the passage. For all we know, the newts are dead from some natural disaster, and therefore the corpses of the newts are just there to be used, and the scientists are looking for a good way to use them. We do not yet know the horrors that will ensue. So these two sentences are very matter of fact and therefore deceptively bland. Option B is your correct answer. Question 50 asks us what best describes the transformation of the newt Hans. What happens to Hans, as we can see from the narrative, is that he was first a colleague and almost friend of the scientists, and then he becomes blind as a result of the scientists' experiments and is finally boiled and eaten. His meat is eaten by the scientists. So how can we describe this path, this transformation? Which of the options fits it best? Is it that it resulted in a deeper understanding of human physiology, as D suggests? There is no application to humans that we can glean from here. Is it that C, it could not be replicated on an industrial scale? We can eliminate C because the final lines of the passage mention that it would be possible to use newt meat as beef substitute in the event of a war. Definitely an industrial scale is implied here. Is it B, that this transformation, what happened to Hans, resulted in a range of valuable products? The problem here is with the word range. While we know that it resulted in the scientists discovering that newt meat could be eaten, that seems to be the only product that Hans's death resulted in. In fact, we know it's inexorable because we can see that Hans went blind because of the scientists' experiments that they conducted on him. So we can surmise from this that because the scientists are not burdened by moral considerations, something would have got Hans eventually. To answer question 21, we need to determine the narrator's attitude to the experiments with trepanation that he says he performed. And this is a really straightforward question because there is simply no evidence for any of the options but one. Did he enjoy the experiments? There is no evidence to suggest that he enjoyed the experiments. Did he regret the experiments? He obviously saw the experiments as something that can produce results that are unfortunate. So he's saying it became unfortunately necessary to dispose of Hans. While he recognizes that that is an unfortunate development, Hans's death doesn't seem to be in his mind something that overrides the usefulness or the purpose of the experiment, so there is no regret. Did he have doubts about the usefulness of these experiments? He uses the word necessary. It was necessary to dispose of Hans because an experiment went wrong. So the experiments are at all times placed above the value of Hans's life, and their usefulness is at no point questioned. Finally, the only fitting option is D. These experiments were performed as a matter of course. Question 52 asks us to select an option to sum up the main concern of the passage, the writer's message, if you will. And my advice for you here would be to ignore the sources of the citation, the Bible and so on, and simply to focus on their content. Let's take this from the bottom up. Is it D, those who call evil good and good evil? Note how there is no moral dimension in the text whatsoever. The scientist is not calling evil good and good evil. The scientist seems to be utterly unconcerned with notions of good and evil as such. Therefore, this is not a well-fitting option. Is it C, man's inhumanity to man? This one is also easy to dismiss because we are talking about man's inhumanity to animals. Is it B, the desolating pestilence? Now, a pestilence is an epidemic, whereas here we are talking about only one animal that has fallen victim to these sinister experiments. There is definitely the potential for a pestilence of cruelty here, because the scientists are talking about using newt meat on an industrial scale as a substitute for beef and so on. But so far, this cannot be called a pestilence. Therefore, we have arrived at the banality of evil, which is your correct answer, A. And of course, the banality here is signaled by the matter-of-factness, by the lack of moral questioning that the scientists demonstrate. In what way does the passage attack its target? That is what question 53 asks us. Does the passage ridicule scientific jargon? The passage contains no mockery, no ridicule. It is practically devoid of humor. Therefore, A is out. Does it twist the logic of scientific discovery? It is a descriptive narrative passage. It doesn't really discuss reasoning, so B is out. Does it invoke the stereotype of the mad scientist? There is really no madness in the passage. The scientist appears calm. He is almost the epitome of rationality, and that is the point. The language of scientific objectivity here, in fact, betrays cruelty and a lack of moral fiber. So D is your correct answer. Questions 54 to 56 are on a paragraph about cardiovascular disease, which also features a flow chart. And question 54 asks us to pick one statement out of 4 which is correct according to the passage. Now, the statement in option A says that risk factor reduction strategies don't affect the rates of CVD, of cardiovascular disease. This is something that the authors of this passage hope is not true. And this can be seen in the second paragraph, where they say that it may be possible to lower CVD rates by using a community development strategy. So while there is no proof as of yet, according to this passage, that risk factor reduction strategies do affect CVD rates, this is something that is implied to be true. Option B tells us that physiological risk factors do not differ between socioeconomic status groups. Now, this is false. How can we prove this? Sentence 1 tells us that risk factors are not equally distributed among different socioeconomic status groups. However, the catch is that physiological factors do not account for all of the differences. This does not mean that they have no role to play in the differences. It just means that they account only for some of the differences, which is not the same as saying that they do not affect CVD rates. Therefore, B is out. Option C tells us that risk factor reduction strategies have a different effect depending on which socioeconomic status group they are applied to. The text says nothing of the sort. It tells you something slightly different. It says that risk is unevenly distributed among socioeconomic status groups, and therefore a community approach to lower that risk would be preferable. It would be something that the authors of this passage consider beneficial. It does not say we need to go to the lower socioeconomic status groups because these same strategies would be more or less effective with that group. That is just not part of the message, and therefore C is out. The correct option is D. Physiological risk factors do not fully account for differences in CVD rates. And this is where the flowchart comes in very handy, because we can see that there are all sorts of arrows going back and forth between physiological, behavioral, psychosocial, and risk conditions. So we see that this is a complex picture that emerges. And this is what the paragraph was talking about as well, that there is more than physiological risk, that there is also things like psychosocial risk factors, and that is why socioeconomic status seems to matter so much. So D is your correct answer. Question 55 asks us, the activity reported in the passage is concerned to. Now, the wording here strikes me as odd. Surely it is concerned with doing something or aims to do something. Presumably that is what is meant here. Does it aim to focus on the risk factors of CVD for individuals? The strategy advocated for by this passage is a community-based approach. Therefore, it is not based on individuals, it is based on community level. It is looking at the problem from the community angle. Does it aim to see why CVD risk factors are unequally distributed? Now, they already have a pretty good idea of why that is. As we can see from the flowchart, we can see that there are risk conditions, there are psychosocial risk factors, behavioral risk factors, and physiological risk factors. So it is not like it is a complete unknown that these investigators are going in to find out. B, does it aim to see whether CVD risk factors are equally distributed? Well, they know that they are not equally distributed. That is the whole point of the passage and the strategy that is being proposed to deal with this problem. Therefore, our only plausible answer is A, include a wider range of risk factors in dealing with CVD. And that is amply demonstrated by the flowchart. And that is what the passage itself goes to pains to explain. Now, like most texts of this nature, this text tries to advertise what is different about the approach it proposes, and this is what question 56 asks us about, from which we can infer what it is saying about most CVD treatment, because it is saying what we are proposing is different from the general approach. And what it says at the bottom of the third paragraph about the general approach is that this program will differ from a population-based risk factor reduction strategy. And in the preceding sentence, it says that this approach, the current approach, will be negotiated between community organizations and health authorities, rather than decided unilaterally by health authorities. So according to the authors of this passage, what characterizes most CVD treatment is its unilateral approach, where the health authorities decide what is going to get done and then that gets implemented. Which option best sums up this feature? Is it that it is aimed at personal empowerment and political action? Now, not only is politics not really mentioned anywhere here, And we saw in the previous question that it is not done at the personal level, it is done at the community level. So this seems completely irrelevant. Is it B, community organization and health advocacy? Now, this is something that potentially could trip people up, because if you don't read the question carefully, you might think, yes, that's exactly what they're describing. The correct answer is B. But of course, that is not what the question's asking you. The question's asking you, what is the other treatment like? What is the other approach like? Not the one that is being described here, but the one that is being contrasted with the approach that the authors are proposing. Is it C, determined by professionals with the involvement of the recipients? Well, as we just saw, it's a unilateral approach where the health authorities go and tell everybody what is going to get done. So you definitely don't get a sense that the recipients are involved. This is what the authors are proposing and are saying is going to be different in their approach. D, determined by professionals without the involvement of the recipients, is the only possible answer. It is the answer that sums up the unilateralism of most CVD treatment.